In the previous video, we talked about importance of entity framework and ORM. In this video, we'll discuss different elements which are present inside entity framework like EDMX, context and models. So in order to understand all these concepts, what I've done here is, you can see that I have created a very simple table here called as TBL country, and inside this table I have two fields, country name and population. Now what we'll do is, let's use the entity framework template and let's create our data access layer and model for the same. And once those things are created, then we'll try to understand each one of these elements one by one. So here's a simple console application I have called as my first entity, which I've created. So in order to use entity framework, let's go ahead, right click, add new item. Now there's a template which is there of entity framework called as the ADO.NET entity data model, right? So you can see that, when you click on this template here, it actually creates a file called as model1.edmx. So the extension of entity files are by this extension EDMX. Okay, so I'm going to go here and say this is my country model. So I'm going to say here country, and I'll say add. Now the next dialog box actually talks about how do you want to go and generate your middle layer and your data access layer. In other words, do you already have existing database design from where you want the entity framework to read and create these classes, or you want to start from scratch? For example, in the current instance, we already have created our TBL country and we are going to use the first option. But let's say you are developing a fresh project and you don't have your database design, then the empty model would be a better way, because probably you will be collecting your requirements, then writing a nice technical document, and in those technical documents you'll be creating your UML diagrams which will actually show how the classes will look like. So in those kind of scenarios, when you're doing fresh development, then the second option is definitely a better way. But in case, let's say that you have already made your table design, or let's say you're working on a maintenance project where the tables are already created, then definitely this is the way to go. So currently, because we have already created our table design, we are going to use the first methodology. Okay, generate all the code from the database design which I'm providing. So I'll do a next here. Now because in the previous dialog box we selected that we want to generate our code from the database, the next dialog box actually says that, okay, can you tell us the location of your database? So you can click on this new connection here, provide your server name, provide your authentication methodology, select your database and press OK. So for now you can see that I've already created this database called as customer DBO. The next thing over here in the screen is a connection string. Now from here to here, I'm sure that all the developers are aware of what it is, but you can see that in this connection string we have some very absurd keywords like CSDL, SSDL, MSL, right? So I'm going to talk about these keywords later on in more details, but for now you can assume that this is the complete connection string which the entity framework requires. Okay, and whenever you create a connection string, it has to be entered into your app config or web config file depending on what kind of application you are creating, right? So this is the name of the connection string inside your app config file. So I'm going to keep it as it is, customer entities, and I'll say next. Now in the next dialog box we need to provide database objects from which we want to generate the code. So for example, you can generate a code from a table, you can generate a code from a view, you can also generate a code from a stored procedure. So currently we have this table here called as TBL country, so I'm going to go and select that. And you can see that there is one more option down below saying pluralize or singularize generated object names. Now one record in TBL country table, probably we would like to represent that record in our application by a country object. But now let's say that if you have lots of those records in TBL country table, then you would like to probably represent it by countries, plural, right? So if you want to follow this naming convention of pluralize and singularize, then you can have this checkbox checked. So what will happen now in our cases, we'll find there is country, it will create a country class, and it will create countries object if you have multiple records. Okay, so I'm going to keep it as it is because it's a nice naming convention. Do you want to include foreign keys columns in the model? Yes, keep it as it is. And what is the namespace name where all this code will be generated? I will keep it as it is, customer model, and I'll say finish. Now the entity framework template create couple of files here, and the most noticeable file is the .edmx file. EDMX stands for Entity Data Model XML. In short, it's a XML file. So I'll explain the structure of this XML file later on. But the first thing, let's go ahead and double click on this EDMX file. So you can see here, because our table name was TBL country, so he has created a country.edmx over here. So let me just double click over here and let's see what we see on Visual Studio. Now, once you double click on this country.edmx file, you will get a visual representation of the class which has been created. So you can see that, the entity framework is now saying that, he has created a class called as TBL country with two properties, country name and population. Now, entity framework is all about bridging two worlds. One is your relational world, where you have your tables, where you define your primary keys, foreign keys, and in this world, in this relational world, we design in thinking normalization and denormalization kind of concepts, right? Then we have our middle layer, or I'll say our model world, where we think in terms of classes, objects, aggregation, composition. We think more about, how we can represent the real world objects, right? So in that terms, even the naming convention should be, done appropriately. For example, it is good to have in your tables the naming convention as TBL country, but a class to be named as TBL country looks very absurd, right? So let's go ahead first and change this class name to just country. All right, and the properties look fine, country name and population. So you can see, how I can go and modify my model world, and I don't need to go and change in the relational world, and I can also go the vice versa. I can go and modify my relational world, and I don't need to really change too much in my model world, right? So that's the power of entity framework. In case you want to go and add some new properties, you can always go and add new properties here, right? So, but that we'll look into later on. So we have this class here called as country with country name and population. Now the next thing you must be wondering is, okay, so this is the class, but where is the code of the class, right? The code of the class is in the behind code. So you can see that we have one is we have the EDMX file, and the other one is we have the .cs file which is linked with the EDMX. So this guy has the behind code. So let me just go and double click on it. So once you double click on it, you will find that there are two groups here. One is the context and the other one is the entities. Now entities are nothing but your classes at the end of the day, or your models. So if you expand this entities code group over here, or the code region over here, you can see that currently we have the TBL country. So for TBL country, he has created a country class. And if you go and see the properties, you can see that it has the country name property, and it has the population property, right? So if you remember, our TBL country had two fields here, country name. So you can see the country name over here. This is the property, country name, right? Population, and this is the population field over here. So the entities is nothing but they represent your model. They represent your classes, that is country class, customer class, supplier class, etc. Now these entities or these models or these classes are awesome. They represent your real world objects, right? So you have a country in real world, and then you have your country in your code. You have a person in real world, then you have a person in your code. So it is great. But now when we take these classes or these models or these objects, slash entities inside the computer, when we say that, okay, we want to use this inside the computer, you can do a lot of things inside the computer with these models, right? For example, inside the computer, you can take these entities and insert into a database. You can take these entities and expose it via a service. You can take these entities and write an XML file out of it. You can take these entities and probably display it on a UI. In other words, these entities and these models, what do you want to do with them? Do you want to insert them into a database? Do you want to expose it via a WCF service? In other words, we need to attach a meaning, a context, for these entities if we want to use them inside the computer. And that's what exactly this next code group does, the context does. Now, when we say ORM or entity framework, right, the context is that we want to insert these entities into a database, right? And this context region over here, this code region over here does the same thing. So if you expand this context region over here, you can see that it has classes. So you can see there's a customer entities class over here, and this customer entities class, basically has an add method over here, and you can go and add the entity into this context over here, and you can add this to database. So this context over here is nothing but it's at the end of the day a class which will actually take these entities and insert into SQL Server, right? So you can think about context as the bridge, who actually, mediates between the entities and your relational database. So this is nice. So you can see that how entity framework template has generated my middle layer, that is our entities. It has generated the data access layer, that is the context, and everything looks good. Now, entity framework, as we said in the previous part of the video, is all about implementing ORM. And ORM is divided into 3 sections. So one, we have the object, then we have the relational layer, and then we define the mapping between those objects and the relational layer. So we would like to see that concept getting implemented in entity framework as well, right? So as a developer, you would be curious, where exactly are those things defined? And that is defined in this EDMX file. Now, as I said, that the full form of EDMX is Entity Data Model XML. So this is a XML file. So if you want to see that relationship of ORM, go ahead and open this EDMX file in a notepad or in some editor where you can go and see the XML output of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and say open this thing with the XML text editor with encoding, and let me press OK. Okay. Now the time you open this XML file, you can see that it's a very cryptic XML file. But let me go and just minimize all those things, and let me show you the important sections, or let me show you the sections which will help us to understand how entity framework maps with ORM concept. Now this XML file, you can see, is divided into 4 sections here. Leave the last section for now, because this last section is only for the designer view of Visual Studio, so leave that section. But look at these 3 sections: SSDL, CSDL, and CS. Now SSDL represents your relational layer or layer of ORM. CSDL represents your object of your ORM. Okay, and the CS mapping content is nothing but which maps the CSDL and SSDL, which is nothing but the mapping layer of ORM. So for example, this TBL country is represented in this storage model over here. So you can see that we have TBL country. It has country name and population field, and the class is represented here in the conceptual model, saying that the TBL country is named here as country class, and in case it is plural, it is named as countries, right? And in this mapping, we are saying the TBL country maps to the country class, the country name column country name maps to the country name field, and the population column in the table maps to the population field in the, or population property in the country class. So in other words, the ORM here is nothing but SSDL, CSDL, and CS mapping content. So this brings us to this end of this video here. So in this video, what we did is we used the entity framework template. We understood different properties in that entity framework template. We then tried to understand what exactly is EDMX, what exactly are context, what exactly are entities, and we also saw, how the XML structure of EDMX, fits our ORM. So I hope that you enjoyed this video. Now in the next video, what we'll do is, we will try to now, display this country rows, using the ready-made classes which entity framework has created.